record the session from now. Okay, it's okay for you?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I think we can start. I left the floor to Valentina to introduce our session. I speak to both the screen and thank you for being there. And Valentina, please.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, I cannot be in Belfast with you because of several personal issues and also for a COVID situation. Let me start this panel with a small introduction of what we are going to hear today. My introduction to this panel starts from afar. Before Chiara and I met at an Italian conference on the anthropological meaning and usage of time, had already met ruins in a literal sense. I was conducting fieldwork among an NGO working on cultural heritage preservation in an urban district of New Taipei City in Taiwan. One of the main activities of this group was providing guided tours to the neighborhood, particularly stressing how an industrial outskirt of an Asian metropolis could reveal a past where countryside and folk religion were widespread. The material testimony of this past was literally ruins, an old brick wall emerging from a steel compound or a parking lot. Several traditional Taiwanese huts shattered by what seemed to be a two-story flat made of concrete, as you can see from the slide. These urban ruins were places of contentions. On the one hand, symbols of abandonment and urban decay, and on the other hand, the persistent past that still had the power to mobilize emotions, memories, and affections. The ambiguity of ruins is a shared pattern in different cultural and historical contexts. In Italy, the historical park of Monte Sole, where Nazi and fascist troops brutally executed women, children, and older people in 1944, has a function to introduce people to the historical tragedy through the ruins of countryside houses and churches devastated by fire. Ruins are testimonies of a traumatic past and political tools for the future. In this Italian case, every brick shouts out loud, never again. And to those revisionists of history, that the tragedy really happened and materially impacted the same landscape. Ruins, therefore, are multi-temporal. We experience the present, simple material remains, but they have the power to evoke the past and shape possible futures. It is not a case that post-colonial literature has emphasized the resilient aspect of ruins, but also the political and moral work behind the preservation, memorialization, or discharge of ruins. Being able to remain a ruin and speak behind the institutional narrative is one of the creative potentialities of a colonial archive that at the same time tells the status quo and the otherwise. Chiara, who worked on the memorialization of the tragedy of the Bayonne's Dam and what has been left around it, precisely pointed out in our meetings the conflictual narrative generated from the same ruined material, the institutional and the country hegemonic. Our anthropological inquiry in this panel is specifically to investigate what is at stake in ruin preservation and when ruins are allowed to express themselves through rotting or simply developing into something else. What stories can material debris tell about the world? This panel starts with the different post-traumatic scenarios of ruins, from Taiwanese white terror to Hiroshima's nuclear devastation. Once we set out different forces dialogue in post-traumatic times, we interrogate the other potentialities and those ontologies that ruins offer to and imbricate ourselves. We then move on to the country hegemonic potentialities of ruins to end with a final session on heritization of ruins. The final debate with Francisco Martinez, who will be our discussant, will discuss how these different suggestions of ruins can shape anthropology otherwise from a methodological and conceptual point of view. The presentations will last for 15 minutes each, and every presenter will have the opportunity to answer quick questions for about 5 minutes, but then leaving the space for the final debate tomorrow at the end of all the presentations. Let us introduce our speakers in the first sessions. And I will end. Okay. Our first speaker is Fan Yi, Fanny Chu is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology at Leiden University. With a research background in Han Chinese popular religion and working experiences at the Museum of Anthropology at National Taiwanese University, she chose Green Island, Taiwan, as her main field site between 2019 and 2020. She focuses on how the heritage of state violence, the imagination of political trauma, and the religious beliefs constitute the contemporary images of Green Island after the end of the martial law period. She also explores how the heritage of state violence coexists with the changing local economic situation and landscape, especially the current rising tourism business, such as recreational diving. Through the lens of popular religion, she depicts and analyzes the entanglements of these different aspects of local livelihood at the periphery of the state. Please, Fanny, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Valentina. Just let me share my screen. Oops. Okay. Okay. Is the PowerPoint okay to everyone? Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's now evening in Taiwan. My name is Fang Yi. I'm a PhD candidate from Leiden University. And I'm now in Taiwan. Unfortunately, I cannot meet you in Belfast due to strict quarantine rules in Taiwan. However, thanks to Valentina's invitation, I can present some of my primary thoughts in this panel. So like what Valentina just mentioned, my research is about how the heritage of state violence is embedded in everyday life on a small offshore island. In today's presentation, I will focus on a specific cemetery on the island. I would like to indicate how the cemetery and other heritage of state violence, especially the ruins of graves and tombs, is recontextualized in terms of various religious beliefs and related practices. Like how can religious beliefs reflect multiple meanings of heritage to different stakeholders? So, anthropology of death. Many researchers have devoted themselves to the heritage of death. But then what can anthropologists do? To me, anthropologists have been examining how diverse human societies respond to death. Like an archaeologist, Howard Williams, indicate that anthropologists have three main contributions on analyzing how memories operate through material culture in societies, which is very different from Western Europe. It includes like monumentality, material culture, and ritual performances. By adopting such an approach, I extend ritual performances to religious belief and practices. During my fieldwork, I noticed that different religious belief and related practices actually reflect how heritage is conceived and interpreted contrastingly by different social groups. So first of all, the remains. Before we jump into details, let me introduce my field site. So this is a map of Taiwan, and you can see it's in East or Southeast Asia. And let's zoom in. So this small island is where I do my research. You can see its position here. So it's a typical tropical island on the Pacific Ocean. And it's an offshore island. So if nowadays you want to go to this island, you can only go there by ferries or plane. The climate is about 17 Celsius to 28 Celsius degree. It's and you can see the temperature maximum here. It's a hot, windy, humid island. And the population is about 2,000 people. The majority ethnic group are Han Chinese. The economic activities include tourism, fishery, agriculture, public servants, and the education systems includes 2 elementary schools and 1 junior high school. So it's literally a small island at the periphery of the state. So nowadays, if you go to Green Island, which is a good option right now, it's a tourist hotspot in Taiwan, by the way. There's only one main road on Green Island. And if you follow this main road here and move to the north side of this island, you will see this National Museum on this small island. And if you keep moving forward, which means this is the museum, and you keep moving alongside these buildings till the end, and you will see this cemetery. Unfortunately, most of the graves and tombs are not in good condition here. They are the ruins of remains, the ruins of the authoritarian past. So why is there a cemetery? So this is because after China's civil war in 1949, the Kuomintang government retreated to Taiwan, and to stabilize its authoritarian regime, the KMT government promulgated martial law. So during 1951 to 1965 and 1972 to 1987, Green Island was a place to confine people regarded as political dissidents. And people are sent here for reform, quote unquote, reform and re-education. And only after 2018, these political prisons were officially transformed into the National Human Rights Museum. So that's why you will see a national museum on this small island. So we now know that Green Island was a place to confine political victims, but it's not necessary to step out the cemetery. Did government sentence people to death on this island? Well, technically, these victims were here because they were sentenced to confinement instead of death penalty. So there's no death penalty was executed on Green Island. So where does the dead body came from? This disease buried in this cemetery, where many died of accidents, suicide, or disease. And one thing here I want to mention is that they were not all political victims in this cemetery, because it also contains some soldiers from mainland China. Remember, it was just after the outbreak of China's civil war, and like 2 million people, including soldiers, were retreating to Taiwan. They were also soldiers from mainland China and were translocated on Green Island. And due to extreme hot weather, like I mentioned before, it is very difficult to conserve the dead bodies and to transport these bodies. So most of the remains, and including soldiers or wardens or political victims, they will be buried on this island. And because the inmates were divided into 12 squadrons, the deceased here were called as the 13th squadron by political victims. So how does this graves and tombs become the ruins? Let's first check the details of normal common graves between 1941 and 1971 in Taiwan. So basically, you will see a pile of earth here that's used to bury the body, and you will see a tablet here that contains information of the deceased. And people can stand at here to mourn the deceased here. But what about the situation in the cemetery in the 13th squadron? So like I mentioned before, the condition wasn't too good. For instance, this one is a grave that belongs to a soldier. You can see actually the shape of the graves is still quite clear, even though the people where people stand to mourn the deceased is covered by dirt. But the information on the tablet, the name, the birthday, the date of their death is still quite clear on the tablet. But for this one belongs to political victims. You can see only 1/3 of the tablet is green. That means the other 2/3 of the tablet is covered by dirt. And for people who do the survey, they literally have to dig out the tablet to see the information of this deceased. And the grave, the earth behind the tablet are also covered by a lot of grass and plants. And for like this one here, you can see a small crack over here. This grave also belongs to another political victims. And the crack here basically means the deceased in this grave is reburied elsewhere. So in order to prevent the spirit of the deceased come back to this old grave, the family members will crack the tablet and let the spirit know this place is not a place for you to rest forever, and you should rest somewhere else. So this is done by family members. So you see different situations in this cemetery. Some of them are in bad situation. Some of them are covered by dirt due to natural causes, and some of them are done by family members. They are the ruins. Okay, so the cemetery is currently designated as Heritage of Injustice or 不义遗址 in Taiwan. But what was heritagized in this situation? So for political victims, they are sometimes called senpai by Japanese, or also to some activists. This cemetery is a sacralized place. Like, they concern this place a lot, even though they know most of the graves in the cemetery belongs to soldiers or wardens who represent the state, and that is on the fact that many political prisoners' remains were moved away. They still want to visit here to mourn the past. So you see, the cemetery is a sacralized place, a token of past, and the identity in this cemetery are carefully articulated. So the political victims and activists go here, they still have to carefully incorporate the identities of those who represent the state, including the soldiers and the wardens. But what about the local residents on the periphery of the state? What about the people on Green Island? And local people told me, like, I would rather not to go there. It's a taboo for the islanders. The cemetery is only for the remains that no one can take care of. So why is this contrast? For local residents, the identities, like the differences between political victims or soldiers or wardens, were not their main concern. Instead, they cared about how they should react to this unfamiliar dead bodies of outsiders. Generally, they use two terms. For example, they say the place is amzam. Okay, amzam is a place that directly translated into filthy. So they use the concept filthy to describe this cemetery. And in fact, local residents have a lot of precaution to prevent getting in touch with such contagious filthiness, either by the help of ritual expert or by the help of time. And they have to cope with this filthiness caused by death. And another deeper meaning is about outsiders. So local residents basically will prevent the lingering strangers, including their spirits. Now let's see one of the examples. So this is how local residents worship or bribe the ghosts in a certain year, in a certain month in the year. So ghosts are chaotic spirits that have no relatives on the place to help them or recognize them or worship them. So ghosts are chaotic strangers that could cause dangers. So what's the proper way to communicate with this ghost? So on this picture, let's take a closer look. These incense sticks are used to communicate with spirit. And you can see in the upper side of this photo, the incense sticks are stick into the ground. And here you see differences. These incense sticks are not inserted into the ground. Instead, they lean against two rocks and not inserted into the ground. In fact, this is the way of showing how local people think they should communicate with God. They don't want to create a place on earth that is stick into the ground and that the ghost will lingering in the place. So after communicate with the ghost, they can literally just remove this place and not letting this incense sticks stick on the ground. So actually, this is not the most proper way, and these are a better way to worship or mourn the ghost, just by not letting the ghosts or strangers stay. So we see two patterns here. And inclusive.
Sorry, Fanny, you have 2 minutes left.
Thank you. I'm almost ending. So we see like 2 patterns here, one inclusive and one exclusive. And inclusive, like the term Bridge and Edwards mentioned in the term dystonic heritage, it mentioned that we need inclusivist approach that seeks the incorporation of all perspectives. So for political victims and activists, they do have inclusive interpretation. They try to incorporate those different spirits of who even represent the states. But for local residents, they use an exclusive interpretation, and they don't want strangers to stay. They want to cut their relationships with ghosts. What they're actually reflecting, to me, it reflects their lineage from the past. They are deciding who are really having the relatives from the past and living until today. However, it also means that their lineage were disturbed by the state violence, because all these victims are not, all these political victims or soldiers, the cemetery were here all because of state violence. So we see 2 patterns here. So here's my conclusion. Both exclusive and inclusive logics behind the religious belief and practices connotes different historical context and memories of the authoritarian past. This is my reference page, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Fanny. I see a question from Lily. Please go on, Lily.
Hi, sorry, it wasn't a question. I was just applauding.
Oh, okay. Is there any questions? We have like about 5 minutes for any questions to Fanny. Can you rephrase the question? We cannot hear from online.
Thank you for the paper. I was wondering, perhaps based on your personal opinion and not just on the research experience, about these the possibilities of coexisting like both agendas, like meaning the one of the local residents and the one of the victims. To what extent they are complementary, or is there a possibility that they coexist, or they kind of rather operate as a, like in a rather tense way, like one against each other? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This is also the question I've been thinking about, because the starting of my research is that some activists will complain to me, actually. They will complain that local residents do not care about these political victims because they are afraid of death, because they are afraid of dead bodies. But like, to me, the refusals from local residents might have some reasons, and their reasons may not be welcome under current political circumstances, but the reason is important to me because it also shows that they are also the victims of state violence. It's just they did not react like what political victims and activists react. So for me, there is a way to make this kind of complementary. Like, for example, how about we do some surveys about local people's impact in during the authoritarian past? It is possible because not being buried properly is a common trauma that happened during the authoritarian past. And I believe, and this is one thing, and I believe this is an experience that can share both between political victims and local residents. Another thing is that I believe local residents also have their own experiences of political trauma. They might not be directly confined in the political prisons, but they are some impacts during my research, during my field where I noticed that. So to me, the question is how to foreground local residents' experiences. And I think that's what I will try to suggest to this kind of situation. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I have one for you, Fanny. Okay. It was interesting to see, I mean, how the cemetery and the museums were differently located, and probably because of time, you didn't spend a lot on discussing on the museum itself. I would like to know from you how the museum narrative is built upon, and if the cemetery is taken into this narrative and how, but maybe it's a too large question, but yeah, just for your reference, maybe we can discuss it at the end of the sessions.
Thank you. Should I answer your question now? Or okay, thank you. But
yeah, we have like 2 minutes. If you want, you can answer it. Otherwise, we can discuss it at the end tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks for reminding me. In fact, if you visit that museum, you will see a model of monuments in the cemetery. They especially set a model of cemetery inside the museum. So some people, some political victims and soldiers died in the cemetery does mean something to political victims and activists. And not just because people suffered there, it is also because they want people to remember that some victims died here. And it is utilized to build some discourse in this museum. Like, for example, people with, there's a exhibition board, and it says that no matter you are the victims of state violence or you are the representative of the state, you are now all lying together in this round. So it's a very incorporated discourse here. And I think they are trying to do this because they don't want to make this heritage too controversial in Taiwan, because memorializing the political victims of white terror is still a very controversial issue in Taiwan. So by doing that, they can somehow lower the risk of irrigating certain people. Let me put it in that way. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it perfectly makes sense to the Taiwan case. So thank you very much, Fanny, for your presentation, and we'll move on to the next speaker. Katiana Lementek. She's an anthropologist at the French National Center for Scientific Research, assigned for the last 7 years to the China, Japan, and Korea Research Institute, part of the École des Hautes Études in Paris. She has worked on Chinese issues for about 20 years. Her main research has been done in the Old Sichuanese area, West China, where she undertook ethnographic fieldwork in 2 counties affected by severe territorial upheavals: the Three Gorges Dam Reservoir Formation in Yunnan County and the Wenchuan earthquake, Beichuan County. In these places, she has been working on a wide array of topics: forced migration, including propaganda and resistance, popular religion and cultural areas, cultural policies, such as civics, festival, museum, heritage issues, and territory, relation to space, native place, affected place, rebuilt space. She's currently finalizing a monograph on religious and cultural tools seized by the population and the government to make sense, interpret, and deal with the forced migration induced by the dam in Yunnan County. Then she will engage in a new research project on affected spaces and territorial upheavals, focusing on their effects on the multifaceted relationships between a space and the people feeling related to it. The paper she wrote for this panel on ruin is part of that endeavor. Please, Katiana, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here, and really sorry for not being able to make it to Belfast. So today I'm going to talk about the interactions people have with remains of their destroyed familiar places. It is based on ethnographic fieldwork in 2 destroyed cities in China. This paper proposes glimpses of reflections on ruins through the experiential approach, looking at direct and familiar interaction with ruins, taking into account their affective and active presence in discourses and practices. The familiarity available is key here. Better seizable through ethnography, familiarity to a site before its ruination have heuristic potential to better understand how people relate to their space and its transformation. Every space might be seen differently depending on the people involved with it. We just saw an example of that. So the name, the status, the definition of a site, its value, the practices that are allowed or forbidden, affects, involved, etc., might depend on the people you ask. Let's say the rubble of a dismantled school in China. We'll come back to that. So for outsider deconstruction worker, it is a workspace associated to professional protocols and consideration of specific material to be dealt with. For an artist or an urban explorer, it can be an inspirational or thrilling site. For social critic, it can stimulate broader reflection on the society. An entrepreneur could see mere rubble that should be quickly cleared out for juicy investment, or a new project for a local politician envisioning improvement. These actors focus on the site, present state and future, which is utopian or dystopian. These actors might project onto this rubble scheme they came to embody of similar space throughout life and work experience. Unlike outsiders, local people have individual and shared experience of this particular school, including the destruction process they might have witnessed. Former neighborhood, professors, students, and staff who lived this place developed other kind of relation, obviously different ones. This relation linked to these wounds, previous states, which can be enriched with new practices, representation, and affects associated with their new state. Through a selection of ethnographic vignettes, I will briefly present few modalities of engagement with runes identified on the field. More details are available in the full paper as circulated. Although the context and temporality of the ruination are distinct, what is of interest here is the kind of attachment or detachment and affective intimacy people develop with ruins of their familiar places. In the first part, we'll explore cases of desired contact, and in the second part, cases of avoidance. But before going further, let's briefly introduce the field sites, Yunyang and Beichuan. So they were both affected by tremendous events. For Yunyang, the formation of the Three Gorges Dam Reservoir on the Yangtze River in 3 rises of water from 2003 to 2009. And for Beichuan, the 2008 Wenchuan earthquake. Yunyang and Beichuan are localized in rural and mountainous areas. When their county seat was affected, destroyed, they were ranked among the poorest in China. Yunyang was my main fieldwork site for 14 years. The county seat was localized below the line of the dam was the reservoir. And during 20 years, the entire city was slowly dismantled and a new town was rebuilt 30 kilometers west. About 40,000 people lived there. And when I began fieldwork in 2004, about 80% of the population had already been moved. I spent altogether about 14 months doing ethnographic fieldwork in the new city. During the dismantlement phase, I visited the old city for fieldworks and to join friends and families for one-day visit to ancestor tombs and temples that were still in the area. Beichuan County seat was severely affected by the Wenchuan earthquake. The town population was about 30,000 and about 1/3 died. Within few seconds, an important part of the city was destroyed by landslide and rock slides. It was later fully evacuated. Few years later, residents were moved to a rebuilt city about 30 kilometers south. The city also includes the population of 6 villages that were raised to build this new city. And in the meantime, the ruins of the old county seat were preserved in their destroyed state and turned it into a heritage site secured for tourist visit. It is presented as the biggest such preserved site in the world. I did 3 fieldwork in Bechuan from 2015 to 2018 in the new city, and I also visited the relax site on several occasions with local people, as well as with organized tour. The context of the Three Gorges Dam and the Wenchuan earthquake were highly politically sensitive, so I developed a loose Bayesian ethnographic methodology, living with relocated families, developing friendship and social network, emphasizing observation and informal discussion. Union people and Bechuan people have experienced through their senses the demolition of their town, and some of them still experience remaining elements. Over the years, through serendipity, I had occasion to record related observation, discourses, and practices. So let's now explore this contrasting interaction with ruins, and first with the desired contact with ruins of familiar places. In Yunyang and Bechuan, I met people who consider ruins as positively connoted parts of a beloved site and past, like Mr. and Mrs. Lu, with the ruins of their old school, the place they met and had their first kiss. Yunyang School was locally famous. Its dismantlement began after the graduation, as they left for the regional capital. Few years later, in 2007, they went back for the first time to visit the tomb of the grandma in the area. The city was still being dismantled. For her, it was a shock. Even partially submerged, Mrs. Lu was able to recognize the urban structure, and she was profoundly affected and cried. Every time I heard her narrate the event, quite so many times, she was deeply moved. During this trip, they decided to look for places they were familiar with and took pictures of what was left of them, mostly rubble. Many of them concerned the school. She carefully kept them in the smartphone, ready to be shown and narrate connected memories. Many stories come with the picture of the school toilets. The fact she took the toilets in pictures usually make her and her audience laugh. It is quite weird to take pictures of such things as both rubble and toilets. But it is a place filled up with her teenage memories. Not only do they continue to share these pictures, but many of their friends post their own picture of the city in ruse and discuss. Shared pictures have something in common. The state of ruination allows them to recognize the site. Not all rubble are deemed valuable. The case exemplifies well the statement of many scholars that a ruin is not fixed. It is as a process, the ruination, that we can seize it. As transitory and vanishing space, people's engagement with them evolves. And one variable may be recognizability. In Bechuan, I witnessed a similar modality of positive interaction with recognized ruins associated to a beloved place. Like Mr. Tang, a mechanic whose family house was just in the outskirts of the city destroyed by the quake. From the bridge leading to the preserved site, he has a clear view on his former home in ruins. From there, he enjoys narrating stories to his young son. The rubble of his familiar place allows him to cherish happy memories he had with his father who died in the quake. Another example is Mo, who regularly enjoyed the rubble of her former house in the outskirts of Beichuan New City. Her house was affected by the quake, but not demolished by the construction work. With her mother, they use the site now, which is in total ruination. We barely can see the house, but now they grew vegetable there, and it became a soothing and peaceful place for them to go. So these cases show that the contact with recognizable ruins may help with feeling of loss through their access and the sharing of positive past experience embedded in them. Yet, ruins are not limited to memories. Rather, new experiences, practices, representation, and affects keep nurturing people's relation with these places. Let's now move to the case of avoidance. People nurturing a topophilic relation with a familiar place do not necessarily positively engage with its leftover materialities. In Yunyang and Beichuan, I met people demonstrating affective link to their native place, yet strongly negative feelings towards its ruins. Fieldwork even suggests that it was more common. Rejection was sometimes strong enough to make people avoid any visual contact, like the case of Deng I present in the paper. He wanted to preserve his memory of the city before the quake. Narration, imagination, dreams, or photograph of the city before the disaster constitute effective platforms to recognize, reconnect with the city. But the rubble embody a painful eventment and might trigger unwanted social experiences. All ruins are not equal. Mo, she cherished her derelict home, but despised the preserved ruined city marked by the death of her sister. In Beichuan, most people told me about this preserved city. This is the place I am the most unwilling to go to. It might trigger their trauma of the event or the loss of loved one. Another reason for people to avoid the preserved city is the ubiquity of the dead. Many bodies were not recovered, and it makes the city, the site, associated with bad omens and potentially filled up with dangerous entities, hungry ghosts. People develop practices to avoid bad effects when they had no other choice but to go near death-attached rooms. It's like launching firecrackers, carrying talisman, wearing red underwear or red shoes, and washing their whole body and clothes afterwards. Avoidance of ruins can also be associated to negatively connected experiences in these familiar places. For example, in Yunyang, the members of the Tia family often use demeaning words to describe the old city, even before its deconstruction. For them, the dismantling work, dusty and messy landscape, was not much different from what they experienced living there before. Dirty streets, old buildings, narrow spaces, and with very bad living conditions. The Tia are relieved and proud to now live in what they considered a modern city. The old derelict town is a reminder of the so-called backwardness they feel they grew up into. Their reaction resonates with the prevalent scheme in China, in which materiality of rubble is devaluated. In the Tia eyes, they are considered as féçus, literally abandoned ruins, rubble of wrecked buildings, rubbish, and not as yizhi, literally sites left behind, ruins as history relates, heritage to be preserved. Obviously.
Sorry, Katiana, your time is left. If you can.
Okay, okay. Obviously, the Tia do not share the same relation the Luz have with the old city. In the Luz eyes, the town recognizable faces somewhat avoided devaluation and received an intimate value. Factors at play here between these contrasting views could be found in divergent social economical experiences. Compared to the Tia, the Luz are financially comfortable, more educated, and had early integrated the cultural heritage shield. I will stop here.
Thank you, Katiana, for this presentation. Are there any questions from the audience? Or from Francisco, if he wants to comment a little bit?
So, I mean, ask Tatiana to elaborate further, because the idea of interaction itself is rather complex, and it can be developed from the point of view of how the ruins are represented by those who are living nearby or affected by them, which is, in my view, the focus that you develop. By following this idea of the social life of ruins, they could also be engaged by non-human actors, which is perhaps something that is not that present in your paper. But there is also a third alternative, which is the one that Kathleen de Silva developed, which is like letting the ruins mutate or unfold on their own. So in this case, the social life won't be told by people living nearby, but it will be accounted or documented without intervening or intervening in the ruins themselves. So more than a question, I wanted to hear more on these, like 3 different ways of understanding interaction, and if you had considered the other 2 alternatives. Thank you.
If I consider what I didn't, the connection is really, what is the last
one? Proposing or outlining 3 possible interpretations of this idea of the social life of ruins, which is something that is in the paper. There is one about the cultural representation of ruins by the people living nearby or affected by them. There is also the one by non-human actors, how non-human actors are intervening or intervening within the ruins. And there is a third one, which is like the ruins having a life on their own, independently from humans, so to say, even if the disaster was produced by all 2 human decisions.
We collect another question for you, Katiana, from the audience. Then you can reply them. Maybe you have to go near us.
Completely awkward. Thank you. It was a really fantastic paper. I just wanted maybe to hear more about the rebuilding of the 2 cities. What was the kind of decisions about how they were rebuilt, where people were placed, and if that had an impact on how they related to the ruins, and whether they were avoided or kind of desired to return. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the last question, because it's actually a part of the program I'm going to develop and question that I'm looking at, and it's really interesting. The connection. I haven't thought about the connection between the rebuilt cities and actually the ruins. The way you presented it. Is there another question, or can I go now? Chiara?
Yeah, it is. Maybe we can do the last question in the 15 minutes at the end of the session, because I don't know how we are, if we are in time or Valentina?
We have like 2 minutes for answering, so I think maybe it's better to.
Maybe it's better to collect some questions for the final discussion. Yeah, now I have to speak. May I? Yes, Valentina, if you want to introduce me, we have to turn the screen.
So shall I introduce you, Chiara, or give Katiana some time to answer some questions?
Do you want the last question for Katiana?
Yeah, tell me the last
Because
question.
that's just 1 minute for answering it. She wants to just briefly reply.
Maybe camera so she can. No, she can see you just from here.
Yeah, can you see me now? Okay,
Yes.
thank you for that. Yeah, I know that it's a sensitive political context, but I was just wondering if any sort of political feelings or views sort of came out even in a kind of like sort of secretly or sort of under the surface way, just because it would seem to me that given the situation, there might be some anger or some.
Yeah, so I will briefly answer to this one. Regarding to the Three Gorges Dam, it was not connected to the social, some people that were not agreeing to be forced moved. But for the Bechuan case, it was much different because the ruins were connected with the deaths of many children that were because of the school collapse, most of the school collapsed. And it was pointed out that it was local government corruption that didn't make a good school. So the ruins were actually the material support for some criticism, even though it was quite difficult at the time. Some artists and they found creative way to criticize and to point out blame with through the ruins, and it's actually an interesting thing. But for the Three Gorges Dam, it's a different situation, and it was the ruins were not used to blame the government, and especially the national government cannot be blamed. It's very difficult, this criticism. So I will stop there and let the floor to Chiara.
Okay, let me introduce you, Chiara. Chiara Calzana is a PhD candidate in cultural and social anthropology at the University of Milano Bicocca. She has a BA in history and MA in anthropological sciences. In her work, she tries to combine the methods of both disciplines. She's currently conducting ethnographic and historical research on memory and the Vajont disaster area in the Italian Dolomites, with a focus on memorialization and monumentalization practices related to public and private places. She previously worked on the use of oral testimonies for the study of contemporary history. In 2021, she was responsible for a funded project to collect testimonies from inhabitants on the Vajont municipality, which produced a public archive of oral memories. Please, Chiara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valentina. So yeah, today I'm here to talk about my research among the Vajont disaster survivors. And it is an ethnographic work that began in 2018 for my master thesis, and that I'm still carrying out today for my PhD, with lots of difficulties due to the pandemic. As you see, I'm always with mask and stuff. So my fieldwork combined observation and participation in community life with a collection of audio recorded testimonies. And in my talk today, I will give you an ethnographic picture of how people approach ruins in the Vajont Valley. And of course, my analysis starts from the theoretical framework that we referred to in our panel description, of course. Specifically in my work, I focused on the intergenerational transmission of memories. And this transmission also transits through places, and and that places are part of a peculiar disaster memoryscape. So I spend lots of time observing the spaces and how they are experienced. The ruins of this disaster are obviously a difficult heritage that must be managed by both survivors and institutions. For me, it was also necessary to take into account the political dimension of memories and emotions of those who approach these places. In the Vaillant case, the ruins are sites of memory where is strong the presence of the absence of those who died that night, an absence defined as the main object of the 20th century that is still at the center of many reflections and experiences in the contemporary times. In many cases, as Primo Levi recalled in his preference to I sommersi salvati, ruins emerge as evidence of a past that someone wants to erase, and they bring us a testimony that victims cannot act. So, in many ways, Vaillant ruins continue to speak to our present and future. So, the Vaillant Valley is located at the border between Veneto and Friuli Venezia Giulia in northern Italy. This is also the border between two valleys, the Piave valleys at the foot of a large dam, where Longarone is located, and the Vaillant Valley upstream of the dam, where Erto and Casso are located. The dam built there in the 50s was the highest in the world at the time, but it was implemented without adequate geological expert reports. So they only consulted experts when the mountain showed signs of collapse. The response was clear. The only way to keep the mountain from collapsing was to avoid filling the water basin. But the SADE, the private company responsible for the dam, could not or did not want to afford the loss of its billionaire investment, mainly because the nationalization of electricity was about to take place in Italy. So in 1963, the newborn Enel and National Electricity Company purchased the Vaillant water basin and the dam from the SADE. As expected, on the night of October 9, 1963, the mountain broke down into the water basin, causing two waves that destroyed everything in less than 4 minutes, except for the dam that is still there. Nobody took responsibility for evacuating the area, even though Enel's technicians were certain of the impending collapse. So this is Longarone before that night, and this is Longarone the morning after. This is San Martino near to Erto before and after. This is the dead too, and there are 450 bodies still missing. So to talk about Vaillant ruins and their role in public and private arenas, it is necessary to know how the reconstruction of living environments took place. Longarone was completely destroyed by the water. The town was rebuilt in the same place over modern ruins. The survivors made this decision, insisting that the settlement should not be moved elsewhere. So new houses, squares, and buildings covered the ruins, with a few exceptions, such as this church tower, the first picture, that remain intact, and the floor and the cellar of a private house that you can see in the second picture, and also under the new church, this one that was made with a shape that recalled the dam. And under this new church, you can also find the foundation of the former one. In the days that followed the disaster, a graveyard for the victims' bodies was rebuilt in Fortonia, an hamlet near to Longarone. It was a classic Italian cemetery with marble stones, pictures of the dead, epigraphs, flowers, candles. Survivors from Longarone used to come here to commemorate their beloved dead. Erto and Casso had a more complex destiny, For many years, the area upstream of the dam was declared off limits, even if the two main settlements, the villages of Erto and Casso, were still intact. In fact, in the valley, the water destroyed just the hamlets near to the water basin. The householders were asked to decide where to rebuild the village. They chose a flat countryside 40 kilometers away from their home. The settlement is known as the municipality of Vaillant, and most of the survivors were displaced there. Only in the 70s, a new settlement began to be built uphill from the old village of Erto. So in the area of Erto and Casso, no one reconstructed the destroyed houses, and ruins can still be found in the woods. As you can see in these pictures, victims' relatives continue to take care of the houses' ruins and used to commemorate their beloved dead in these places. This is also because almost none of the 158 victims from Erto and Casso were found. Their bodies are still missing, so they don't rest in peace in a cemetery. They still haunted the woods that surrounded their living places. To commemorate the victims, survivors put on the ruins marble stones with names, epigraphs, pictures, cross, candle, flower. They also built some altars or little chapel like this one. They even built altars with some objects found into the house's ruins, recalling the materiality of the vanished everyday life. As Fulvia, a survivor, said to me the first time I met her, ruins are the real sites for familiar memories and of the dead. Here, survivors can transmit memories of what happened to their children and grandchildren and teach them how to take care of the dead souls. As you can see there. This is even more important nowadays because Longarone survivors don't have the same opportunity to commemorate their dead in a traditional way. In fact, the Vaillant Victims Cemetery in 2003 was transformed into a monumental cemetery, as you can see in the picture. Here, flowers and candles are forbidden. A new entrance was built with a shape that reminds the dam, and white marble stones with white names replaced the former stones. There are no pictures of the victims and no epigraphs. So in the territory of Erto and Casso, you can still find signs of traditional Catholic piety for the dead, but also pictures and personal memories and political claims about what happened in the valley. But in the monumental cemetery lost its function of sites for familiar and community memory, and also became a depoliticized and neutral space, mainly frequented by tourists. In fact, the monumental cemetery became part of the official Vaillant narrative, a narrative that talks primarily to tourists. To analyze touristic itineraries, it's crucial to understand how the Vaillant history is transmitted. This is an unknown history even in Italy. You cannot find Vaillant history in school books or in monographic essays. To understand what happened, you have to go there or look at some Wikipedia pages. So tourism is an important element, and it's also related to future of Vaillant ruins. The sites of the official memory scape for the tourists that visit the valley are the dam, the Victims Monumental Cemetery, and the new church. These sites are clearly instruments for a politics of memory linked to large infrastructures. The institutions who manage the official memory sites ask survivors and volunteers that guide tourists to follow a technical narrative, numbers, data, and death toll. Personal histories are considered too subjective. In this way, the narrative about Vaillant disaster is at risk of being relegated to a dimension of large numbers and huge monuments, losing forever the life histories of people and families who lived, died, survived there. In recent years,
3 minutes, Chiara.
2,
3.
3, it's good. In recent years, a community project have shown the willingness to tell the Vajont history from a different point of view, moving the gaze away from the dam. The project I Will See You with the Site of Memory is a workshop run by a small group of survivors and descendants to create a website and an app for mobile phone. These portals show the visitors that the ruins of the destroyed, show the visitors where the ruins of the destroyed houses are located. The purpose is to tell the history of the ruined places and transform them from private sites, now known only by victims' relatives, to public spaces. They collected testimonies from those who personally knew the people that died that night, producing a polyphonic narrative voice that guides visitors through both the destroyed places and the biographies of the victims. It was a very interesting process, and it will be interesting in the future to look at the transformation of ruins into public space. How will they change? And it's not always simple to find a way to transform ruins into a common heritage, valuing their role for public memory. In the case of the rebuilding of San Martino Church in 2020, many residents did not like the results. And the recent events remind us that ruins preservation is not something that we can take for granted, as it showed the case of the house and cellar in Lungarone, the only remaining ruins of a house I mentioned earlier. This land was to be expropriated to build a road to Cortina for the upcoming Winter Olympics Games. So, conclusions. In the Vajont area, whatever disappeared has been overshadowed by a politics of monumentalization, which prefer huge monuments instead of personal histories. This narrative tempts the visitor to feel a generic pity rather than to understand. 60 years later, rediscovering the everyday life of vanished places and transmitting those memories to new generation provides an opportunity to structure a counter-hegemonic narrative against attempts to depoliticize witnessing practices. This is possible through the collective caring of alternative memory sites, namely the ruins. The ruins scattered over the territory of Erto and Casto give the space a structure of feeling that contributes to the orientation of the activity of the living. As Janet Karsten also points out, the best way to investigate the politics of memory is to hold together the experiential, emotional, and everyday dimension of kinship with the political meaning of kinship itself and its practice, which constitute a real challenge to the power. The ruins themselves create an imaginaries and affective orientation toward the memories of the dead and the landscape, and then transform the scarce of the latter into materials for a future imaginary.
Thank you, Chiara. Any questions for Chiara's presentation?
Yeah, I got a question.
I can.
Francisco here, and but maybe, yeah, we can transform the setting here.
So, Chiara, you are approaching these ruins as if, you know, like picking up a thread with the past, like putting the emphasis on memory making. But there is another like dimension of the paper that is very promising. Perhaps you could also elaborate further, which is the one of responsibility. The title of your paper, if I remember well, was like building a catastrophe, something like this. But actually, what it was built was an infrastructure that was materializing like modern ideals of mastering nature, as well as how the state is kind of being like read and felt by locals. So my point of my question here is about responsibility and how these implication of the term victims and the implication of the terms negligence. This negligence was indeed written in one of the tombstones in the slides.
Yeah.
One of your slides. So this aspect of who is victim of whom and who was negligent of what is very promising. Will it be the engineer? Will it be the fault of the state? Is it the fault of some expert? Or is it of modernity in abstract terms? Thank you.
The progress. This is also Katiana, and maybe then I can answer you both if you want.
Yeah, my question is about a detail. You talk about two examples of monumental metaphor of the dam, like the entrance of the cemetery and the church that was rebuilt afterwards. I'm really intrigued because in China, in the main case of the Three Gorges Dam, the government, the national government, built museums in the area with the form of the dam, but to praise the dam because like it's to participate to the glorious narrative on the dam. But in your case, the dam was really associated to a disaster. So I was wondering who decided these two monumental metaphor of the dam. Are these same kind of actors, like local politicians, or were they linked? And what, more importantly, what do the local people think about it?
Yes, thank you, Katiana. Anyone? Or I can reply maybe and yes.
Yeah, you have like 2 minutes for answering.
Okay, 2 minutes. Of course, Francisco, I take into account the full history of Vaillant. This is a history of responsibility and also of becoming victims, but also to avoid the level of victims for who is remain, who is still alive and want to witness and want to be an actor of his own history and of and they actively take care of their own past and present, of course. And in this time, when people get older, and yes, they have a son, they have children and grandchildren, but they need that the state or the public administration take care of ruins because it's a work that it's hard. And they also think that that ruins had to be a patrimonialized heritage for collective and not only a personal space. It was till now, but now they had to become public. And so we can see who will take the responsibility of take care of that places. And for Katiana, people, survivors and the communities don't like the choose to shape and scatter the dam everywhere. The dam is everywhere, not only in the three monuments, but also in the other monuments that recall the disaster. And the dam itself is still there. So you can still look at the dam from Longarone, but you can also look at the church that is shaped from the dam, and you can also look at the cemetery entrance. Dam is everywhere, and it was an architectonical choice that because the state give the reconstruction work to this famous architect from Europe in Venezia. They were architects, they work with concrete, with materials that are really different from the material that built houses in alpine villages. So they rebuilt all the city in concrete and also they scatter the dam. But the new enter of the cemetery is shows that they take in 2003. So I don't know. I cannot understand why they are continuing to scatter the dam. But people, community and survivors, that they don't like that choice. So I don't know. It's very interesting that still doing that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chiara. And then the last speaker, Lily Canel-Mathieu. Lily Canel-Mathieu has a joint honors bachelor's degree in anthropology and art history from McGill University. Is currently completing a master's degree in social sciences at the Institut National de la Recherche Scientifique, and will be undertaking PhD in anthropology at McGill this upcoming fall. She performed ethnographic fieldwork in Hiroshima, Japan in 2019, has been thinking about everyday encounters between humans and non-humans in different ways ever since. She's a researcher at the Fernand Dumont Chair on Culture at the Abeona Ensovia Chair on Artificial Intelligence and Social Justice. And her current research focuses on AI, cultures, and algorithmic imaginaries. Please, Lily, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you for the introduction and sorry for not being able to be there. I'm in the move between Boston and Montreal, so I'll be with the U-Haul truck tomorrow. So happy to see you virtually. So yeah, the title of my presentation is Reimagining Times in the Ruins of History and Ethnography of Hiroshima's Atomic and Modern Human and Temporalities. Oh, okay. So the field, as Valentina just told you, I was there in 2019 in Hiroshima in Japan. The date is important, notably because it was before the pandemic, but also more importantly because it was exactly 74 years after the blast of the first atomic bomb that was ever directed at enemies. Other atomic bombs were exploded before Hiroshima, but they were doing as experiments in the States. So if ever you're interested in that, you can read Joseph Maskell's ethnography about the States. It's very interesting. It was an indigenous territory, so there's a whole lot of issues going on there. But all of this to say that Hiroshima, the little boy bomb wasn't the first atomic bomb ever exploded in human history, but the first one directed at an enemy. So the Americans blasted it on Japanese territory. So the bomb exploded on August 6, 1945. And it is important that I was there 74 years after the bomb because it was believed at the time that nothing would have grown in Hiroshima for 75 years. So I was there right just to prove this point of, obviously I'm not the only one who went to Hiroshima in these 75 years. People live there, a lot of people live there. It's also a touristic site. There's a memorial for the bomb, a very big museum, which is very interesting, and a lot of other monuments in the city. It's actually quite a big city, very thriving economically as well. Also, just to give you a little bit of details about the explosion. So the core of the nuclear explosion, the temperature reached 7,700 Celsius grade, so that was very, very, very warm, and it completely devastated an area in Hiroshima on a radius of 13 kilometers. It killed 66,000 humans at first impact, so within the first 5 minutes, and then a lot of other people died in the following minutes. hours, weeks, months, and even years. Some survivors are still living to this day, or at least they were when I was there in 2019. I was very privileged to listen to a conference and to speak with some of them. I hope they're still alive. I'm not in touch with them, but they were quite aged, obviously. And some of them have cancer. They have long remaining issues from being so harshly exposed to the radiation on the first impact, but also throughout their lives, because many of them have stayed in Hiroshima and have lived there their entire life. So more specifically, I was in Hiroshima, but I was in the Shukeien garden. The Shukeien means shrunken scenery garden. So it is actually a garden from the 17th century from a feudal lord. And it was designated as cultural property in 1940. So before the Japanese involvement in the Second World War, which is pretty interesting. And it was completely burned down by the fire because of the intense heat that followed the nuclear explosion. Only one tree survived from the garden. It's called a survivor tree. It's a ginkgo. And it's still standing there today, thriving, all full of leaves and seemingly very healthy. There are a lot of trees, I think about 25 trees all around Hiroshima that are called survivor trees. They have survived the bomb and still live to this day. And they were only identified as so in 2011. There's an association actually tied to UNESCO that decided to make them visible, make them apparent, and there are some signs that say that these trees have survived the bombing. So about the garden, it's interesting to note that it is a 17th century garden, and because it all burned down, we couldn't take, it looks like ruins right now, but it doesn't physically look like ruins because they have Japanese and people from Hiroshima have rebuilt it after the bombing. So I think within the 5 years after the bombing, and they have reproduced it with the minute attention to historical details. And this is very important. A last note on the field, obviously I was in Shukeien Garden for most of the time. I was there for 3 or 4 months in the summer of 2019, but I also went off into the Peace Memorial Park, which is where the exact location of the bomb dropped. I was also around Hiroshima. There's a castle, there's many historical sites, but my main site was the Shukeien Garden, where I worked with gardeners, I observed tourists, and I observed the managers of the garden as well. So this is just a picture of the garden just to illustrate how lush the scenery is, how thriving the nature looks like to be. So this is to demonstrate also how uncanny radiation can be, because still to this day, Hiroshima has a certain level of radiation. People live there, so it's not a level of radiation that is intensely dangerous on a daily basis. But if you are there for a long time, you might have important consequences to your health. Thyroid cancer is one of them. But you know, nowadays there have been explosions elsewhere, obviously in Nagasaki as well, but also accidental explosions like in Fukushima in 2011, other places in the world also. So we could argue also that there is nuclear radiation all over the world because it travels in the air. So even where I am now in North America, I'm exposed to nuclear radiation from test sites in the United States. People are in Ukraine, in Europe are exposed probably to radiation from Chernobyl. It's all over the world, and in the oceans now, even fish from the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans have been found to have radiation in their bodies. So it's everywhere. I think Hiroshima is more perhaps of a symbolic place of nuclear radiation than it is materially or tangibly, because now it is everywhere. But all of this to say that it just looks very normal. So this is a view of the garden. So now an argument I am trying to make, an argument I am trying to make here is that time with a capital T and as a concept or of a method to think of time is destabilized or has been destabilized both in Japan and in Hiroshima. So first about Japan, it is something I have read in literature. Here I'm referring to Latour. Obviously, Bruno Latour is not talking about Japan specifically, but about the moderns. We have never been moderns, his famous essay. The other authors here are Aretunian, Maurice Suzuki, and Allison, who wrote specifically about Japan and the idea that in Japan, in postmodern Japan, unilinear, homogeneous, standardized, and progressive modernist time has gone astray. So this idea of progressive time is related to an appropriation of the future and a distanciation from the past. It is the idea that modernist time is tied to corporate capitalism, and that in Japan, there is a lot of hopelessness and that progress has stopped making sense. So there is this idea that time with a capital T, with a method for grasping temporality, has lost its meaning and its usefulness in Japan right now because of the state of the economic world, and also social link is also very difficult in Japan, but that's a whole other story. As for Hiroshima, there is a lot of temporal confusion in the city and also conceptually, because Hiroshima as a city, but it is also a moment in human history, a very important moment. But what we must not forget that people live there today, people have lived there in the past, and that it is a city that is tied to a specific moment in history, but that existed before, exists after, and will continue to exist. It is also a very important moment, symbolic of a very important moment in planetary history, because it's a kind of a historical reset geologically. If you know some carbon dating techniques, some of them, there is a reset in 1945 because of the atomic blast. So it is all around a very, very important moment, 1945. But there is temporal confusion. There is a nostalgia and narratives about national history that relate to a Japan that is older than 1945. There is a lot of tropes about futurity in Japan. And there is this idea that people should be clinging to a certain historical version of Japan, and notably in the Shukeien Garden, which is from the 17th century. A lot of the managers of the garden, when I asked them what was particular about this garden, were always telling me about the 17th century, the way it was built historically, and they would never mention the fact that it was destroyed by the bomb and that it was rebuilt. So this is kind of a part of history they didn't want to cling to and they didn't want to relate to. They just wanted to think of Hiroshima and of the Shukeien Garden that existed before that. So I see that time is running. I'm sorry, I'm talking more than I was planning to. So
you have
there's
4 minutes, actually.
So 4 minutes?
You have 4 minutes.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Perfect, so there's a lot of temporal confusion conceptually in Hiroshima and in the Shukeien Garden. And as for the actuality and continuance of nuclear radiation, it is my argument that it vaporizes standardized time. So there's if you've ever been or if you plan to go, you should go to the museum for the atomic bomb. It's a very big museum, very interesting. And the first thing you see when you enter the museum is a clock that has stopped at 8:15, the time in the morning the bomb was dropped, because the internal mechanism of the clock was burned down, it was liquefied. So the clock has stopped forever at 8:15 from August 6, 1945. And I think this is a very potent symbolic manifestation of the destabilization of modernist time, which I would relate modernist time to the clock and to the work hours. You know, the way to contabilize time hasn't always been the same. And isn't the same in all human populations and non-human populations. This is something I will tie back to later in the presentation if I have time. But all of this to say that time really, time with a capital T is a big struggle and a big conceptual puzzle in Hiroshima. And I was saying before, Hiroshima also symbolizes the Anthropocenic reset of planetary time, although everything looks normal in Hiroshima, and specifically in gardens like the Shukein Garden, in parks in Hiroshima, trees look fine, vegetation looks fine, everything looks perfectly healthy. And this was very odd to me and very uncanny when thinking of the very longue durée of the post-1945 nuclear radiation. So now, what my argument is that we need to find alternatives to the modernist vocabulary of time with a capital T, and to give way to different understandings of temporality, because we should understand, it is my argument, that times are multiple, they are indefinite, indeterminate, entropic, all the adjectives I've written here. It is liberated. Times is a qualitative possibility. It actually are qualitative possibilities in plural. Time is potential. Singh writes of polyrhythmic assemblages. Karen Barad writes of heterogeneous pursuits of space-time mattering. So I just think it is important to open up to different understandings of temporality. And I believe that this is made possible in a garden such as the Shukein Garden, specifically in Hiroshima, but it could be argued that it would be the same in gardens all over the world. So what I found among many other things in the Shukein Gardens are, and I only have a few seconds left, so phenomenological methods for regrounding oneself in time's qualitative possibilities. So I think that the phenomenological problem of time with a capital T is a distribution of attentiveness. This is also a problem of modernity. And my argument being that modernist time is not true phenomenologically, an answer to that is that we can engage with different kinds of temporalities if we engage sensorially with things such as gardens or settings in which we can do more than human encounters. So I think I don't have much time left, so I add some illustration here.
Yeah. Time is finished, actually.
Okay, so yeah, just very briefly, one sentence: life in ruins can suggest new ways of being attentive to and understanding the world. So thank you, and sorry for taking up more time.
No worries. Thank you, Lily. Any questions for Lily's presentation? Oh, Francisco, okay.
Thank you for your talk. More than a question, I got like some suggestions. One is about the possibility of distinguishing between slow ruins and fast ruins. In the sense that the ruins of the atomic bomb happen like instantly, in a moment. However, the memorialization of them have been happening in a longer period. At the same time, it created an experience that can hardly be translated into words in the form of trauma. And if we understand the care after these ruins as a way of healing this trauma or dealing with this trauma, there are experiences that cannot be accelerated. This is an experience that it is not even therapeutic in the Jungian or Freudian sense. It's therapeutic in the more like phenomenological one, which is the one that you are applying, if I understood well. And the second idea is the sacrifice. So there was this area was sacrificed for a bigger role, in the sense of for the future. You sacrifice something in the present, like Arwin, that is done for well-being in the future, this bigger role. So this like temporality, complex temporality is also interesting and could be developed further in the paper. The idea of sacrifice and the idea of a slow and fast growth.
Thank you. Can I reply or should I wait to see if there are other?
Yes, you have like 3 minutes for answering questions.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you bring up the fact that there are the immediate ruins and the ruins that are more on the longue durée. There is something I wanted to touch upon that I haven't had time, but which also relates to other presentations we've seen today, notably Fanyi and Katiana. They are in the Shukeyan garden. Decades later, after 1945, they found an historical photograph of a corpse, so human corpses, 64 human bodies, I think, that were led in the Shukeyan garden. And they had never seen this photograph. It just kind of resurfaced. And so after seeing this photograph, they did some excavations and they did find these bodies, these 64 bodies in the garden. So this is actually a very important site of death. So these are people who gathered in the garden to drink water from the pond because there is a pond there with turtles and fish. The heat was so hot, they wanted to drink water so bad. So they went there to drink from the little pond, the little lake, and they had been radioactive black rain falling all over the place. So drinking the water just made things worse and they immediately died. So where I'm going with this is the fact that people never knew these bodies were there. They had been buried there without any mark, without any way to remember them. And what I found interesting is that now we know, because they did find these photographs, I think in the 1970s, but I might be wrong. They found this photograph and then they did the excavation and found the bodies, and they only placed a little like poster saying, oh, talking about these bodies and putting a photograph of this body. There is no mound, there is no grave, there is very, very little to commemorate this body, which I find to be sad. And if we want to relate to Fanyi and Katiana, we could describe these souls as angry ghosts because their past is unresolved. We don't know who these people were. No one is taking care of them in the sense that many cultures in East Asia feed the ghosts with food and drinks. So no one is there to do this for them because no one knows who these bodies belong to. So there is very little commemoration going on. When I was there on August 6th, there is a big commemoration on the site of the atomic blast, and at the Shukeyan garden, they did a little celebration on August 8th, so 2 days later, to commemorate these 64 bodies. But this is only one thing that is done annually, and it's very impersonal because they don't know who these bodies belong to. So I think there is something very important going on there with memorialization. I'm sorry, this is hard for me to pronounce, and the care for rooms. I found that there is very little care given to these specific bodies in this specific location, and care in the Shukeyan garden was very much given to the natural scenery and entertaining the historical appearance of the garden rather than thinking of the human bodies and animal and non-human bodies and beings that died there. So I found that to be very interesting, and that's an interesting comment about healing. We can argue perhaps that the idea to grasp on to the historical appearance of the garden is a way of healing for them. And as for the second comment, I'm not sure I have something to add on to this, the sacrifice in the present for the future, but that's an interesting thought to entertain. I will keep thinking about this. Thank you.
Okay, so we have like less than 50 minutes for the debate at the end of this session. Of course, there's Tatiana has to answer a lot of questions that the others addressed to her. but I just want to add a small question for all the speakers. Maybe you can answer later on at the end of the whole session, but I would like to answer to question right now. What struck me about this this session is the filthiness of ruins. The fact that, especially for the Chinese, the two Chinese and Taiwanese cases, there was an interesting point about how hungry ghosts are fed, and also the filthiness itself. The fact that ruins can contaminate people. They are not just reminders of the past or traumatic past, but also how to deal with death right now. And also, Chiara mentioned about the different ways of doing cemetery and taking care of deaf people. So I would like I would like to know from you what's your opinion about this filthiness, and whether we can draw a kind of comparison between different approaches to filthiness according to Chinese, Japanese, and Italian context.
Maybe begin.
Yeah,
I'm going to go right now on what you just proposed. I don't think that the death attached to ruins is a specific characterization of ruins in general in Asia, or because it's very similar to what's happening in Japan actually. But ruins, it's not the ruins that is problematic. It's a place where there is a dead, that there is nobody did a ritual for the spirit to become an ancestor. This is a problem. The ghost that which is not feed up, so is becoming dangerous. So in my fieldwork, so many times people told me, careful, don't go there or don't go there because it's dangerous, and especially if I have children with me, they don't have to go through this. It's not because a place is in ruins. The ruination and the death, from my experience, of what I read, is not considered as indirect relationship. A place in ruin is not something that is considered as dangerous or filthy. What is dangerous is the presence of a spirit that is not fed up. So, it was my answer to your question. But ruin attached with death, like when there is a disaster or something, like some tombs that were left there and nobody do that. So they became, the tomb is in ruin, but what more importantly is like nobody go there to clean up the tomb. So it's becoming dangerous. So I'm keeping the floor to take the opportunity to respond to Francesco's proposition about the way he saw three division for the social life of ruins, like the local people in one way, the non-human actors in another one, and the social life of ruin by themselves. My way of looking at my data and the way I do research, this kind of division is not operative for me. The way I look at the sites, the affected place, the territorial upheaval, places that were destroyed in some way, my approach, which I developed in the paper, but I didn't have the time here with the 15 minutes, is the anthropotopia approach is really marked by what I am interested in when I look at the site is that how different kind of groups look at these sites. So you don't only have the local people You have the local people, you can have tourist people, you can have any, like I say, the entrepreneur who come or the worker who comes there. A lot of different group of people can be attached to have a relationship to a place, and they see differently. So what I'm interested in is to separate this kind of group and to separate their own anthropotopia, the way they connect themselves with the place. So for me, there is not familiar local people in a way and non-human entities in another one. All these groups might give agency to non-human actors. It can be ghosts, hungry ghosts, like I said. For example, me, when I visited the whole city, the first time, I didn't really realize that the body were not excavated. So for me, it was like another tourist site. I didn't, for me, the dead was not a problem. When I knew it was a bit of a problem, not as much as the local people, because it was their loved ones. So you have different kind of, this is the way I see, and I think is what is very important in anthropology, because the experiential approach of ruins have been completely put aside. Most of research have been working on memory, but public memory or political issues or identity issues in a more general way. But how local people, but also people looking there, going there, have a direct relationship, affective or material relationship with these ruins. It's need to be studied more, because it's really a new field of research, and it's something we really lack of information, especially in anthropology, which is our methodology, the ethnography. We are the best equipped to do such kind of research. So I'm just leaving, sorry for being long.
Okay, I see Fanny raising the hand, but also I know that Clara wants to answer to Katiana as well. So, who wants to go first?
I can do it later. So Katiana, please go ahead.
Okay. Just to say that, yes, it's a very good question, Valentina. And also in my case, it's related to the question that Katiana has given me in the. It is something that it's about the management of the ruins in the present, and because to talk about the experiential approach to ruins, we have also to look at who is managing that ruins, and also I think that about the topic of the shape of the dam that is scattered everywhere. I think that maybe the dam is still a sort of fetish, the fetish of the progress of modernity, and it's something that is still, this kind of discourse, of this kind of narrative is still in the air. And some people came to the Vaillant Valley to know what happened yet, but also to admire this huge dam. So you can, so maybe yes, survivors cannot appreciate the fact that the dam is everywhere, but tourists are mainly there for the dam. So the dam is, it's also a marketing, it's a logo. You can find magnets or postcards with the dam. And it's something that it's recalled in all the monumentalization operas. And I think that if we manage the public management of the memory, it's oriented to big monuments and to sell these acceptive narrative, this technical narrative about what happened, and also to depoliticize the narration. I think that maybe the passage to a familiar management of ruins to a public one, it could be dangerous. In my opinion, it could be possible that ruins will be left in the not in that the ruins never will be at the center of the public narration about this history, and that maybe they can transform the touristic experience involving ruins, but not the familiar memories and practices to approach that ruins. And so this is something that we have to take care that didn't happen, that will not happen. I'm sorry, I'm really hard. But Feng Yi, if you want to.
Yes, please, Fanny.
Okay, just a quick feedback to what Valentina has just mentioned. In fact, I think what's interesting in this kind of comparison is that in each case, in each context, they all have their own special react to those like hungry ghosts or the ghosts or the spirit they are not worship. Like in my case, there once was a teacher who is specialized in Han Chinese and asked me, is there any kinds of inflation of ghosts happening in your field? So I thought, okay, so here inflation means that sometimes if a spirit accumulate enough worship, they will get some kind of higher social status, like unknown spirits somehow become a more important deities, and their deities somehow become an even more important deity. So this kind of inflation. But what's interesting in my field site is that didn't happen. Outsiders are always outsiders. So there must be some kind of like special local context happen on Green Island that this kind of inflation did not happen. So this is also part of my research that I want to know why outsiders are always outsiders. And the other thing is that actually at this, in my case, they are some new age like religious group kind of blur this kind of situation. So this new age like religious group, they will travel around, go to place that has rumor that it was haunted, and they will go to those places and do some rituals and say, okay, now we purify this place. But actually, at least in my case, local people don't like that because the appearance of this religious group basically means, yes, you are haunted. And local people just don't like that. And also for like political victims and activists, they also don't like this kind of situation because you are kind of like damage the spirits they are respecting too, because they are already sacralized, but now you are saying now they are the target that need to be purified. So they are different actors kind of blur the boundaries of different identities in my case. So I think maybe in each case, but I do like Kaliana's cases. I didn't even know that wearing red underwears are not even allowed. That is something very religious. So thanks for the interesting information. Thank you.
Lily?
Yes, thank you. And just to relate to what Fanny just said, it's interesting to note that for my site in Hiroshima, there was American occupation after the war was won by the Americans. And so I think this relates very importantly to how the bodies were dealt with in Hiroshima and especially in the Shukeien garden. So bodies in the site that is called the A site, so the site where the atomic bomb was blasted, these bodies were managed, I would say, more respectfully. There is a mound, they tried to identify the bodies, but the bodies have been buried in the Shukeien garden, which is approximately, if I can say, I think 5 to 6 kilometers from the site of the bombing. They have been buried very little respectfully. Only one picture was taken and no other historical record of the way their bodies were treated as being put in place. So I think this is interesting to know that it is because the Americans were there and got involved, and I think it would have been made different if the Japanese people, if the local people would have dealt with these bodies. So I think this could relate to Fangi's intervention and the presentation. So I think, yeah, this is just what I wanted to add. So I think there are also national narratives and national identities that come to play with how bodies are dealt with. I think the Americans have different beliefs about how the dead should be treated, but also they weren't their own, and they were in a sense their enemies. You know, the Japanese people were the Americans' enemies during the Second World War. So I think these are very political connotations to the way they would treat bodies and bury them afterwards, and then not commemorate them appropriately for the cultural context in Japan.
Thank you, Lily. We already passed the time because it's like, yeah, more or less 10 minutes more than required. And thank you everybody for participating, and hope to see you tomorrow from my side. Don't know if Chiara wants to have something.
No, it's okay. And thank you everyone for being there. I hope to see you tomorrow. Even I know that some time change is quite difficult to manage in the morning. So see you soon. And now we are going to the drink and coffee. Maybe Francisco wants to say something? No, maybe tomorrow.
Tomorrow we'll have more discussion.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Yeah, see you tomorrow.
Thank you.